I'd like to introduce Professor A.C. Grayling, who is a philosopher, author, and academic. He's a Master of Northeastern University, London, which used to be called the New College of the Humanities. He is one of the UK's most well-known and most accomplished public intellectuals, and today he'll be delivering an address on his new book, Who Owns the Moon, which is on the philosophy of, who owns the moon. So if you join me in a round of applause for Professor A.C. Grayling.
Thank you very much indeed, and I hope you won't mind if I stand to address you. First, my thanks to the Union Society for its very hospitable welcome today. I see that there is something subversive about it, which is that they give you a very good dinner before you come, which is slightly undermining, but I intend to do my best. Well, you would have noticed, if you've been interested in the press over the last couple of years, an increasing number of reports in the press about lunar landings and about activities by organizations like SpaceLink and SpaceX and Starlink. This is the tip of a very interesting iceberg, because for the last couple of decades and more, hundreds of billions of dollars have been invested in the prospect of a return to the moon and to venture beyond. And the reason for it is not merely scientific and theoretical. Indeed, it's scarcely scientific and theoretical at all, except in that the science which is done in these events relates to the major endeavour which lies on the horizon. And this is the commercial exploitation of resources which are known or believed to be on the moon, on asteroids, and perhaps also eventually Mars. And this is why such large investments of money and time and energy and expertise have gone into this project. And it's because the people who were putting this effort and this money into it expect to get very considerable returns from it. We are on the brink of seeing human commercial industrial activity reach out into space. Now, there's an aspect of this which is very good, indeed several aspects of it which is very good. One is that it's obviously more desirable to mine on the moon than it is on our own planet, which has been so despoiled by our commercial and extractive industrial activities over the last several centuries. And also, of course, there will be, in the process of the technological developments that make this happen, there will be a lot of things that will have a more general application and will be a benefit to us. I don't know whether your frying pan is coated with Teflon, but Teflon is the result of the developments in the earlier phase of space or moon exploration back in the 60s and 70s. It's just one small example of many of the way that technologies tend to generalize and turn out to have much more interesting uses than their first use. So there's a lot there, it's a great deal that we could look forward to as a result of all this endeavour. But I wrote this book, which is called Who Owns the Moon, in order to raise some questions about the nature of this activity. Because the framework that exists at the moment for managing activities, humanities activities in space, is extremely weak. There is a treaty, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty of the United Nations, which was in fact a kind of silver lining treaty of the Cold War. At that time, the United States and its allies, and the USSR as it then was, and its allies, were having a very tense standoff in certain parts of the world. So along the Iron Curtain in Europe, in the Arctic, where the US and the USSR physically abutted one another. And they were quite anxious that parts of the world and parts of space near the world that needn't be a trigger of conflict between the two blocks should be parked. There should be some way of just setting them aside so they weren't a problem. In fact, this was a motivation for the 1961 Antarctic Treaty, to which I will be reverting later because it's held out as an example of an extremely good international agreement and something that on which one might model an agreement for outer space. But that too was a byblow of the Cold War. It's not the United Nations Treaty, but it happens that a number of states, principally by the way the UK and through its proxies of Australia and New Zealand, claimed sovereignty over very, very large parts of the continent of Antarctica. And a number of other nations did as well. Norway, you may remember they got there to the South Pole first. France, and during the Second World War, while the European nations were distracted by what was happening on this side of the equator, Chile and Argentina laid claim to parts of the Antarctic as well. And as a result of the frictions that arose between the different parties who thought they had ownership of large tracts of the Antarctic, because of that, and because they were all, as it happens, part of the Western Alliance, the United States encouraged them to get together and arrive at a treaty that would park the question of sovereignty so that there wouldn't be friction between them. And they got the involvement of the USSR in this because the USSR was quite keen to be in that arrangement also, given that neither the Western nor the Eastern Bloc were very keen for the other side of that standoff to use the Antarctic for nuclear testing, which, by the way, the United States had contemplated doing before an Antarctic treaty was reached. That's a pretty horrendous idea, but at any rate, it was a fortunate byblow, as I say, of the standoff, that the Antarctic became a protected zone. And the idea that the treaty lay at its foundations was the idea that it's going to be a place of peace, of cooperation, of scientific activity only. There would be no commercial activity there. The environment would be protected. So in that way, it was very far-sighted. Its motivations had nothing to do with good hearts, really, as I've explained. But since the inception of the Antarctic Treaty, it's been held up as a model for how other treaties, and in particular treaties relating to space, might be. Now, the same kind of motivation lay behind the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. This, as I say, was a UN treaty. Its motivation was the same. It was to park the moon. The prospect of using the moon as a site of nuclear testing had also been thought about, as you can imagine. But the UN treaty said, right, no one is to make any sovereignty claims or ownership claims over the moon. There's to be no militarization of the moon, no nuclear weapons there. But it otherwise designated the moon as a terra nullius, a no man's land. Didn't belong to anybody. Therefore, anybody who could get there could do what they liked there because it wasn't controlled other than by those two stipulations about sovereignty and militarization. And that was thought to be enough at the time. But with the rapid advance of technology, even then, back in the 60s and 70s, the UN very quickly saw that the prospect of people getting to the moon, a prospect which had been, of course, realized at the end of the 1960s when the US Apollo missions first began to land men on the moon, they saw that the question about sovereignty, about anybody staking claim to the moon, about the fact that the Apollo astronauts planted stars and stripes on the moon, they saw that something a bit tougher was needed. And they tried to get another treaty. They gathered together the interested parties, the active parties, and they tried to get another, stronger, and a more general framework of agreement set up. But they failed. And by 1979, the UN agreed, recognized that it wasn't going to get a treaty, so it agreed to issue a declaration. The United Nations issues declarations, statements, when you can't get treaties or something binding. And the declaration of 1979, in effect, says, well, everybody who gets to the moon or goes out into space is just going to be good chaps. Now, as it happens, the pushing of human feet on the moon by the end of the 1960s, that was not something which is really a kind of precursor of what's happening now at all. If you cast your minds back across the landscape of recent history, you will remember that in the mid-1950s, in 1956-57, there was a global geophysical conference of scientists looking at the Antarctic, looking at the oceans, looking at the structure of the surface of the Earth. It was from that plate tectonics was first mooted and then discovered by empirical research. But also, of course, the interest in the timing and positioning and the accurate drawing of the latitudes and longitudes began to involve some interest in space as well. And it happened that during the geophysical year, the Soviet Union put 2 satellites into orbit. And then you may remember they put a dog into orbit a couple of years later. And then in 1961, they put a man into orbit, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, first man to orbit the Earth outside the Earth's atmosphere. And this put the frighteners on the United States of America big time, because, you know, the USSR seemed to be steaming ahead in the space race, seemed to be dominating the new technologies of this. And it was for that reason that John F. Kennedy made that famous speech in 1961. He had wonderful speech writers. He said in that speech, he said, we, meaning the United States, are going to put men on the moon by the end of this decade, meaning the 1960s. We're going to put men on the moon by the end of this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. When you do hard things, you grow. A marvellous remark, and a deeply true one. But of course, what it was all about was my rocket is bigger than your rocket, really. It was just a kind of macho posturing on the part of the two rivals in the Cold War. And when it looked as though outer space was too expensive and it wasn't really relevant to the tensions back on the surface of this planet, interest in the moon died away for quite a long time, right up until about the beginning of this century. And by about the beginning of this century, people began to consider the following fact, that again, with the tremendously rapid advances in technology, with the new mobile telecommunications, with the advance in computing and the introduction of AI into so many spheres of life, with the coming of networking of mobile telephony systems and so on, and the need for the kind of materials required for these new technologies, which are in short supply on Earth. So some of the minerals needed are difficult to get and in short supply. And so attention turned to whether or not these resources might be available in space. They're also available, some of them are generated at the bottom of the oceans, and thereby hangs another long and curly tail, because the United Nations has also for a very long time been trying to find some way of managing the prospect of mining in the deep oceans outside territorial waters. There, of course, there's a whole different raft of problems, because damage to the ecology of the seabed, pollution of the water column above the seabed, the emission of noises over thousands of miles that would disorientate whales and dolphins and so on. All that is a much, much more serious problem that is faced environmentally on the moon. The moon, as far as we know, has no life on it. It's not going to be disturbed by mining up there. But the effort that the United Nations has made to do something about a convention for the law of the sea is a very useful thing to look at, because its failure, and it has failed to get a comprehensive law of the sea, is because major players, like the US in particular, have refused to sign up to it. And they've refused to sign up to it because they don't want an international treaty inhibiting the activities of their private companies and entrepreneurs who might be able to make a profit out of the seabed. And this fact is a very significant fact for the moon, as you will see. Okay. So the renewed interest in the moon is an interest in getting resources from the moon. Now, by this time in the early noughties, it was no longer really possible for most states, with one major exception, and the major exception is China. And I'll be talking about the Chinese space program in a moment. But for most states, and the United States not least among them, had been progressively shrinking the tax take in ways in which a kind of vacuum was opened up for private enterprise to come into the space required of services. You know, so here they are, one kind of political view here says if you, for example, stop publicly funding the NHS, then private health services will come in and take over those functions, and there will be a shift of emphasis. The vacuum there will be filled up by health companies such as exist in the US. Something similar has happened with the space activities, particularly in the United States of America. So NASA, the space agency of the US, no longer itself, out of publicly provided funds, has a space program. What it does now is it commissions from private companies. So SpaceX and Starlink, which is a Boeing company, and others have now come into the zone and are providing services commissioned and licensed by NASA. So some of the big players looking to the moon for commercial returns from the resources there are private enterprise agencies in the what is now called the Artemis Consortium, so the group of countries that have signed up to this set of accords, the Artemis Accords, are engaged in fostering and encouraging private enterprise to get out there and to get hold of these resources. India is doing it as well. India is part of the Artemis Consortium. The other player is China. Russia has just come back into the space game just recently in the last couple of years, having been out of it for a very long time. And it's come back into the space game as a partner of China, but it's very much the junior partner, because China has the resources, the money, the expertise, big time, in a way that Russia really doesn't any longer. And China is a major player on the moon and in space. And it has done some of the most successful lunar landings in recent times and exploration of resources on the moon. So there are the, but just by the way, footnote remark, it is a fact that should, in the course of this discussion, become uncomfortable to you, that the way things are shaping up in the race, the Wild West, which is opening up out in space, is taking the form that looks uncomfortably like the old East-West standard. So the Artemis Accord companies, a Western alliance effectively, and then a China-Russia axis on the other side. So there is a reprise, not identical, not exact, but at any rate too familiar in a way to be comfortable, given what I'm just about to say. But before I say that, before I say what I think the downsides are, what the risks are of all this, let me say a little bit about what kind of resources these agencies think they're going to get their hands on. Well, for one thing, there is water ice on the moon, on the South Pole and in the deep craters. The water ice is made of water, and water is made of hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen can be separated, and out of the separated gases you can make rocket fuel. And this is tremendously important because it will make much more possible and much cheaper flights between Earth and Moon if there is activity, mining activity, for example, in the shipment of resources back to Earth, then the fact that there is a fuel available to do this on the Moon. Well, back in the noughties, a couple of companies in the United States have already stated that they were going to set up a petrol station on the Moon, in effect, out of these gases. They've already started to explore with the United States government the legal questions of ownership of resources on the Moon. And they have, in fact, announced that they intended to make fuel available on the Moon within 10 years of the announcement they made, which was back in about 26 or 27. Of course, it has taken them a bit longer to get round to it, but at any rate, that is the aim, and that is one of the resources. There are lots of other resources of the kind that are indeed available on Earth, but are much more easily available because they don't involve any kinds of environmental restrictions or government controls or royalties to be paid to local authorities and so on. And these are things like cobalt and nickel and titanium and copper and so forth. But the regolith on the Moon, the regolith is the dust and rubble on the surface of the Moon, is rich in helium-3. And helium-3 is a gas which is hugely attractive for the prospect of nuclear fusion energy. As you know, the nuclear energy that we use at the moment, nuclear fission energy, nuclear fission creates radioactivity, it's dangerous, if something goes wrong, it's happened at Chernobyl and so on, it's very toxic, but nuclear fusion is clean. Until very, very recently, the great problem with nuclear fusion is that it takes more energy to get energy out of the fusion process than you do get out of it. But the engineering difficulties are now on the brink of being solved. And in fact, there have been reports quite recently of fusion producing more energy that goes into it than goes into it. And once these practical difficulties are overcome, the prospect of clean, cheap more or less endless energy from nuclear fusion, which by the way is the power source of the sun, is extremely attractive and urgently required on Earth. Now there's very little helium-3 on Earth, but there is an abundance of it on the moon. It's in the dust and rubble that lies on the surface of the moon, the regolith. So this is a big attraction. At current prices, a ton of regolith, a ton of helium is priced at $4 billion a ton. That's about $2,000 US a litre. That makes your pint in the pub look a bit affordable, right? $2,000 a litre of this gas. So it is incredibly valuable. A handful of moon dust is quite literally much, much more valuable than a handful of diamonds. And this is one reason why all those people who are putting a lot of money into getting to the moon, I talk about hundreds of billions of dollars invested, are expecting to get big returns. They're not doing it for charity or for science, they're doing it for business. Now I want to pause for one moment and ask you this. How do you conceptualize what $1 billion is? Or even indeed what a billion is? Because we talk so glibly, don't we, about billions and billionaires and $4 billion US for a ton of helium, without really understanding exactly what we mean when we say that. Well, here is a way of conceptualizing it. 1 million seconds is 2 weeks. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. That's the difference in the order of magnitude. So when we're talking about billions of dollars, we're talking about huge sums of money. And one of the prognostications that has been made is that the kind of returns on investment that might be expected within 50 years of serious activity beginning out in space runs not into the billions but into the trillions. So we're talking about huge rewards, which explains this huge endeavor. So you may think from what you've read recently, there have been a couple of crashes on the moon, modules haven't really made it. We look about all the excitement over the fact that SpaceX managed to get 4 successful launches and got their module back into the ocean, or parachuted down safely. That Starlink managed to get its 2 astronauts to the space station, and it all looks very, very toddler-like, or sort of stumbling attempts. And therefore people say, oh look, this is the problem of the future. We've got enough problems in the world today, why don't we focus on them? But of course the answer is it's not a zero-sum game. We can look at the problems we have in the world today and think about the future, remembering that if we had done something 20 or 30 years ago about some of the problems we face today, we might not be facing the problems today. So it always pays to look ahead. And when you look ahead, you can look at all the benefits and the prospects, as I did right at the outset, all the positives, but we need to look at the negatives. And what are the negatives? Well, they're implicit in what I've already said about the amount of investment already made, the amount of investment being made, and the expectation of very rich rewards. And the fact that the moon and the asteroids, and eventually Mars, are a terra nullius. They're not governed by anything other than one very out-of-date, feeble treaty, the 1967 treaty, about how activity out there is to be managed. Because you see, when there's competition with such high stakes and rivalry, where there is so much to be gained, the great danger is conflict. If you look across the landscape of history, you see how very, very fruitful competition and rivalry are in conflict. Now let me give you a precedent from the Antarctic. In the middle 1980s, China became a treaty party to the Antarctic system and immediately began to build its first research station. There are now 5 Chinese stations on the Antarctic. And just in very recent times, over the last couple of years, China has said that it wants to treat the area of the Antarctic around its research stations as what it calls a special interest zone. Now, if you pause and reflect for one moment on the implication of that, you can see that that phrase, a special interest zone, is just a kind of weasel way of saying that we own this bit. This is our bit, that we in effect are asserting sovereignty over it. There is one powerful motivation for the Chinese to say this, which is that the moratorium on mining in the Antarctic comes to an end in 2048. And the terrible hunger that the world is suffering from for the rare earths, by the way, there are rare earths on the moon too, also very valuable for these advanced technologies. There are rare earths on Earth. They're not that rare, but they're very difficult to access on Earth, but much easier on the moon. So that's another important point. But anyway, when the moratorium on mining ends in the Antarctic, it's quite likely that mining activities will begin there, not least in the special interest zone that China claims, because China, with a rapidly developing economy and very advanced technologies, is extremely hungry for these resources. So there is an anxiety and an example of what might happen on the moon. Supposing you set up a base on the moon, even if it is not crewed by humans, but operated by robots. But there's your base, and it's doing some strip mining of regolith, and it's packaging it up, and the module is managing to get it back to Earth, and it's extremely valuable, being used in research or actual applications. You don't want anybody else landing anywhere near you. If they land near you, they might sandblast your equipment or knock it over or interrupt its telecommunications and so on. So you're going to say, I want an exclusion zone around my base. I don't want anybody landing anywhere nearby. Now that's just another way of saying, this is my special interest zone. And the minute that you've started to talk about special interest zone, you are in effect, de facto, talking about ownership or sovereignty. In effect, you begin to carve the moon up under the regime of a company, as it might be, if it's from the western side of this activity, or China, if it's on the Chinese side, or Russia. And the minute that you start having borders and boundaries and walls and fences, you lay the groundwork for conflict. Borders and boundaries and fences have been so prolific in the conflicts on our own planet. So inevitable has been the result of competition, rivalry, and exclusion, othering, keeping people out, wanting to have control over some area, that the prospect of it happening out in space seems to be more rather than less probable in the long term, given the high stakes. Because you have to add to these considerations the fact that already hundreds of billions of dollars have gone into this, and people are doing it because they expect a return and they don't want anybody else knocking over their equipment or getting in the way. Hence, the situation which is evolving in relation to the moon is a situation that too easily could become a matter of conflicts, and of course the conflicts won't stay up in space, won't stay on the surface of the moon, they will happen here on Earth. Indeed, it is possible that if we find ways of managing and coping with or mitigating the effects of climate change, which is the great, great challenge that our world faces today, and if the conflicts around the world, in the Near East and the Sudan and in Ukraine and potentially in the East China Sea, if these conflicts don't generalize and turn into more global war, if we survive these two great threats now, the next great threat will be from the gold rush out into space, from the Wild West conditions of space, if we have no framework in place, no regulatory framework in place to govern them. Now, very interestingly, I have argued in this book that we should seek such a framework, that we should try to get a very, very robust and enforceable framework for how all the different agencies and states now going to be operating in space should agree with one another and should be managed. It should be a treaty, it should be a binding treaty. It should be one where there are remedies for breaches of the treaty. It should even perhaps be a kind of outer space court like the International Criminal Court to deal with difficulties. Of course, this is idealistic. We know that treaties are only observed by the parties to them for as long as it's in the interests of the parties. You only have to mention the words von Ribbentrop and Molotov to know how much a treaty will really mean when it's no longer of interest to anybody. But at least it provides some kind of framework. Like all the human rights instruments around the world, human rights are violated on a daily basis in our world, despite the UN Declaration and the EHRC and so forth. But their very existence at least provides something to appeal to, or some measure of one banister on the staircase at least. And that's what a really robust outer space treaty might be. The extraordinary thing is that the response that I've had to this book from the space industry has been very negative. Why? Because they don't like the idea of an international treaty getting in the way of commercial exploitation of these resources. It's a replay of why the US won't sign the Convention on the Law of the Sea, because it doesn't want to get in the way of its private companies digging up the seabed. They don't want anybody interfering or having some treaty obligations that they have to observe when they get out there in space and try to recoup this huge investment that they've made in doing so. But there's another point, and this one is one that will, well, it's not so fanciful, you'll see what I mean. Another point to bear in mind about this anyway. Back in the 1930s, there was a Russian lawyer by the name of Vladimir Mandl, M-A-N-D-L, who was very interested in the question of airspace above national territory. Obviously, at that time, air travel and aircraft and so on had become much more of a thing, and so there was a question about does a plane from one country flying over the border of another country, does it violate something? Is there need for some kind of arrangement about this? And so there was international discussion culminated in the Chicago Convention of 1944 about air travel. In fact, that convention is the root of what governs air travel in our world today. And you may be very happy to know it is a much more successful example of an international arrangement than the Antarctic Treaty. But he was interested in this and he was thinking about it, and then of course he thought, well, what about the air above the airspace where the aeroplanes fly? What about the whole atmosphere above the country? What about space above the country? Can a country lay claim to the sovereignty of the universe above its country? It was Arthur C. Clarke, by the way, famous 2001 author, who pointed out that since the Earth rotates, this would effectively mean that every country was claiming to the whole universe. And so obviously that was a bit of a non-starter. But Mandel, who was a tremendously imaginative thinker, and by the way, although a lawyer, he was also an amateur rocketeer. In fact, he designed and even built a couple of rockets. Back in the 1930s, this is not something many of you will remember, there was these black and white movies, Flash Gordon, with a little rocket dangling from the string and sparks coming out of the back. And the very idea of rocketry in space and what have you was already alive, even at that time. And of course, before the end of the Second World War, in 1944, rockets were being used. The V-2 rocket was the first guided missile that was in use, which is why the rocket engineers of Germany at the time were spirited away by the Soviets of the United States of America, Wernher von Braun and others, to work on their rocket programs. Anyway, there's a whole lot of other stories that circle around this. So Mandel was thinking about the future of space, and he felt, given the development of technology, given humanity's exploratory instincts, given the fact that there are worlds out there to be explored and maybe to be exploited, it's inevitable that eventually human beings will go up there and colonize the moon and Mars and the near solar system and eventually the solar system as a whole. And then he thought to himself, well, when that happens, after a time, as happens with the colonies we see on Earth, they will grow and they will mature and then they'll want to become independent. And that in the longer term future, there will be independent states and civilizations in space, on the moon or Mars and elsewhere. Of course, the thought of H.G. Wells and the War of the Worlds comes to mind, and that's a pretty horrific idea, but generally, this is well within the bounds of probability. But I mention it for this reason. We, at this moment, as we begin to expand our activities just to the moon, even with all the difficulties that confront us now, but with this big investment meaning that these difficulties will be overcome, we are planting seeds for what will happen in the longer-term future of space, in those colonies that might develop on the Mars and on the moon. What are the seeds in question? Are they seeds of how we would like to be able to behave on Earth under the government of a treaty about obligations in respect to the rule of law and human rights and due process. Is that the kind of organization under which the future colonies will begin their lives? Or will they begin their lives in the way that China is run today? Or the way that employment contracts and corporate activities run today, depending upon whether it's Artemis companies or China who is determining the future development or giving birth to these activities out there in space. It's an interesting question, isn't it? You may like the idea of the colonies in outer space being, based on company contracts. You're not a citizen, you're an employee, and that kind of thing. Or maybe, Chinese style. You may like that, but on the other hand, you may wonder whether our adventure, that is humanity's adventure into space, isn't an opportunity for trying to think ahead, prepare, arrange for a longer term future, even though we are right seeming at the very beginning of this enterprise. Wouldn't we like to do it more rationally? Couldn't this be an opportunity for humanity to start growing up and doing something a bit better? So, that's the burden of this book. We need a proper framework, and we need the framework for now because this is the next possibility of major conflict in our world after climate and wars and so on, and in this century. But then also because there is a longer-term future, and if there is a humanity in the longer-term future, it won't be confined to this planet. So what do we want to see? The shape, the form, the values by which it grows. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we'll now move to questions. Please state your name and college for the minutes, and we'll start at the back.
I'm College. So, given that a colony in space at some point, so considering you might initially want automated, ways to build stuff, obviously, at a certain point you will have, towers. People who function in it. So you will want them to be quite skilled. But how would they be motivated to go there, given that wealth probably wouldn't benefit their person? It might be sent home to their families. But how do you motivate highly skilled people to move to these colonies?
Well, we would be repeating in a much more high-tech sort of way exactly what people have done so very often in the past. I mean, cast your mind back to Henry the Navigator and the Portuguese sailors who began to explore a way to get to the Spice Islands, to preempt the overland route for all those wealth-producing resources that came from the east. Explorers, adventurers, settlers. When in 1492 Columbus discovered, to the great surprise of the people who lived there already, the Americas, the aim there, of course, was fundamentally a commercial aim, and the people who sailed on those ships with him and the people who followed the conquistadors to Central America were entrepreneurs and merchants, and so there are people who, and don't forget that the West Indies, relative to the Iberian Peninsula back in the 15th century, was further than the moon and more frightening. So, it's in the human DNA to do this kind of thing.
Sorry, Ben?
You can follow up if you like.
The difference there is that there is hope of return. So wealth can be accrued by exploration. It's not meaningful wealth. So I would put that out.
Anybody else? Yeah.
So my name is Armand of Barber College. Do you think that, because I've seen over the years people talking about space tourism, like maybe having bases on the moon where people can go to for tourism. Would that, in your opinion, be maybe in the future an excuse to actually start from companies and maybe even from governments, like, as an excuse to then expand slowly into the moon?
By the way, there are commercial companies already offering the prospect of space tourism. That's almost certain to be, one of the things which is on offer. Also, companies offering burials on the moon or scattering of ashes there. By the way, I don't know whether you saw the news report about the big cleanup being done on Everest, because the path up to the top of Everest is a huge open trash can, including dead bodies and so on. Well, the moon has already, to some extent, started to be like that in a small way. It's a very big body, so the number of crashed lunar modules is not that many. The fact that the Apollo astronauts left their diapers on the moon when they visited, well, seems rather yucky, but I don't think that any microbes from them would have lasted very long in its atmosphere. But there's litter on the moon. There are going to be bodies buried on the moon. There will be tourists there. All those sorts of things will happen as part of this more general story. And the point to make about it, I suppose, is that whereas when that sort of thing happens on Earth, there is a serious environmental impact, on the moon there won't be. And so the constraints on it will be fewer. It may be distasteful to, people plighting their troth in the light of the moon, or being romantic about it, or singing songs to it, and so on. But in fact, from the practical point of view, it won't make much difference to the moon, not for a very long time.
Alex, I'm at University College. You said earlier that these organisations aren't doing this research not for science or for charity, but for business, basically. And I was just wondering, how should scientists who actually work on this research act as not to be compliant to the effects this Wild West scenario could have?
Well, of course, there is a certain amount of science involved, trying to identify the location of resources, especially minerals, and what they are and where they are, how they might be extracted. So to that extent, there is a bit of science, but it is very implicated with the commercial side of it. The fact is that at the moment, anyway, there is so little funding for independent scientific research in situ on the moon and with the asteroids. By the way, I keep mentioning the asteroids and Mars because there are two plans afoot for establishing a lunar orbital station. Rather like the space station around Earth, there are two separate west and east plans for stations around the moon to be used as arrival and launching pads for traffic between the Earth and Moon, and also for further exploration to Mars. SpaceX, Elon Musk himself has said that his activity relative to the Moon is very, very much a jumping off point for Mars, because he wants to get to Mars. And with the rate of change in technology, it's quite possible that he'll be there in the next quarter of a century. So, we have to wait and see. But to get independent scientific activity, which is not in any way subject to or compromised by or under the thumb of, commercial interests, at the moment looks very bleak. Because at the moment there are no serious neutral government activities, and better still, groups of governments that are sponsoring this kind of thing.
Next question. Over there.
Timo Lange, John Snow College. You just mentioned trash on the moon, and there's been a lot of talk about the debris in our atmosphere, the amount of that debris increasing, often it being very, very small, moving at such fast speeds that eventually it might become a problem to even leave our atmosphere, because any vessel that's trying to leave would be hit by this debris. What do you think what role do you think that will play in the development of treaties that regulate space travel and later the colonization of space?
Well, that's an interesting point because the orbital zone around Earth, so low, medium, and high orbit around Earth, is actually very close to Earth. The Moon is 260,000 miles away, and when we talk about the orbital zone around Earth, we're talking about something much, much closer. Now, the orbital zone is already very congested. As you know, your GPS, for example, works on the basis of constellations of satellites that communicate with one another, and there are a number of different such constellations up there in space. There are lots of other weather and surveillance and communications satellites in space, and there are quite a few dead ones as well. So yes, it is very congested. But when we talk about the congestion of the orbital zone, we don't really mean like the traffic in the centre of Durham at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's not quite like that. There's still a hell of a lot of empty space in between the congesting items. So at the moment, there is some concern about it of the kind you raise, but it is not such a major concern that SpaceX and Starlink and the Chinese and the Indians are really worried about sending something to the moon at the moment. The really interesting point that comes out of this, and I'm very glad that you raised this point, is the following. The arrangements governing the orbital zone around the planet are a multiplicity of inter-party arrangements. So there's no UN treaty about the orbital zone. It's a little bit like the sort of state-to-state or groups of states getting together to set up treaties about fishing in their territorial waters or whatever. This is what substitutes for a general law of the sea at the moment. There's a lot of inter-party agreements, local agreements, and that's how things work in space. There are some more general agreements, a bit like the agreements observed by airlines around the world, to ensure that there isn't too much interference or deliberate interference of one set of communications instruments in space in the orbital zone by anybody else. But already the military value of being able to interdict another country's assets in the orbital zone has resulted in the development of anti-satellite weapons, including electronic weapons, lasers, other so-called ASATs, anti-satellite assets. And most of the major space-active countries have already set up as parts of their armed forces, space fighting forces. The most notable of them is the United States. During the Trump administration, a thing called the Space Force was set up as a fourth arm of the US military. So the US has a Navy, an Army, and an Air Force, and it now has a Space Force. And I'm not kidding you here. Sailors in the Navy are called, personnel in the Navy are called sailors. In the Army, they're called soldiers. In the Air Force, they're called airmen. In the Space Force, they are called guardians. And don't believe me, go online and have a look at the uniforms of the guardians of the US Space Force. And I kid you not, they're taken straight off the page of Marvel Comics. Absolutely straight off the page. You can also go, Mr. Google will give you free and for nothing, a PDF of the manual of the United States Space Force. And the very first paragraph of that manual will tell you that the United States regards space, and I quote, as a war-fighting zone. This word, war-fighting, is one word, is a new coining, a war-fighting zone. Now, every major nation, a space-active nation now, Chinese, for example, have got a space force, but it's part of their air force. The same is true of Russia. But it seems fatuous to repeat so obvious a point. But that if you build an army, you're going to use it one day. If you just in the same way as if you mark a boundary and somebody tries to cross it, you're going to punch them in the nose someday. It's all kind of inevitable. There is an awful inevitability about these cycles of behavior that humanity has locked itself into. Cycles of behavior modeled on the kindergarten, where everybody's throwing their toys around and and not sharing. You know, I mean, that's how the world is, and this is how it's just repeating itself in space, which is why it matters tremendously that we think about how we're going to behave when we get out there.
Over there.
Hannah Dwell, Gray College. A while ago, Bertrand Russell talked about a world government, and if we look now at the current situation we're in, a lot of the power in the world is situated in places we wish it wasn't, anti-democratic places. So the US has, in essence, a space army. China could too. Can you expand a bit more on the incentives of how you would incentivize these different agents to cooperate, considering especially the physical distance, so on the moon, would it not be more difficult to restrain them, more difficult to hold them to ethical principles? So do you suggest some kind of demilitarization through militarization? How would you get everybody to cooperate in this?
Well, it's a very good question because it relates to perhaps the most difficult thing that would follow from getting some kind of international treaty. It's very difficult to enforce the international treaties that already exist. And as I said earlier on, parties to treaties will only abide by them just so long as it serves their interest to do so, and that they will resile the minute they become onerous and get in their way. So it's terribly hard to do it already, and it would, as you point out, be even more difficult in space. Not, by the way, that the moon is any more anonymous or remote than, let us say, the deserts of Sudan, where this terrible war is happening because of attempt to get control of the gold resources in that country. So, but I mean, there is a difficulty across the board. We're trying to stabilize and manage and ensure that there's redress and adjudication when disputes arise. So that is a very, very familiar and rather entrenched problem, and it would certainly apply in the case of space. As to world government, I mean, I'm a fan of Bertrand Russell, but I always thought that the idea of world government was pretty horrifying, because if you had just one government for the whole world, run by the present crop of Tory MPs, let us say, Boris Johnson, then that would be, or Orban or Xi Jinping or whoever, that would be absolutely horrific. Okay, so the ideal, I suppose, would be really to make the UN effective. Now, I'm a massive fan of the UN in one way, because I think that everything it does, every single instrument it promulgates, always emphasizes peace, progress, cooperation, protection. I mean, one of the reasons why the US and some other countries would not agree to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is that the UN said the bed of the open oceans is a common inheritance of mankind. It belongs to nobody, therefore it belongs to everybody. And if you're going to mine it and make profits out of it, those profits should be shared with the whole world, because the seabed belongs to the whole world. So what about countries that don't have a shoreline or a marine industry? Why are they going to be excluded from being able to benefit from the fact that resources are being taken from the seabed? Now, this is my companies in my country having to share their profits with some people on the other side of the world who haven't even got a boat. No, that's what they're going to say. And that is what they're saying about the moon. This is why the involved agencies don't want a new space treaty, because that space treaty would, as sure as night follows day, say the moon is no one's, therefore everyone's, and anything that we get as a benefit from the moon should be shared by humanity. And SpaceX or Starlink or China are going to say, okay, yeah, sure, I'll share my profits with everybody else. Answer, no. Of course they're not. Why not? Well, apart from the normal human thing about this, they've invested billions. They'll say, but no, but people in wherever didn't invest anything in it, why should they share in the returns from it? You can just hear the arguments even before they're put and made. But that's the difficulty. It's the old kindergarten cycles of behavior, and to try to breach them is very difficult.
Next question.
For the Armitage from Durham School. You've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but you kept mentioning having a robust framework for ownership and treatment of the moon and like space and things like that. I was just wondering what policies you would put in place to make that stronger than the ones like in the Antarctic or the old space treaty, to make it successful and actually likely to do something and be followed.
Well, actually, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, if you read it, it is probably the longest, biggest, most detailed, richest document ever produced in this respect. It is a wonderful model, and if it could be enforced, it would really provide major protections for the oceans and a major benefit for the world. It doesn't, by the way, outlaw mining on the seabed, but it attempts to try to manage it in a very environmentally respectful way, and also a way in which, as a common global resource, it can be shared. So there is a kind of model there. We would need to think very seriously really about how to get enforcement to work practically, because that would be hard. No doubt, even as with the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, long delays and great expense and legal processes, anyway, not accessible really to people who don't have the resources to get to them. But some way of trying to manage it is better than not doing anything at all. That's the point. So I iterate the point that I made about the fact that human rights instruments don't stop human rights violations very much, unfortunately, but they do provide something to appeal to and something to provide a kind of framework for. So it would be along those lines, I suppose, that one would hope for.
At the back, over there.
Adam Anderson, also from Durham School. Between regulated, or ideally regulated, private companies and government-run space agencies, which do you think would do a better job practically as far as advancing human capabilities in space?
Well, it happens that the Artemis Consortium have come up with a thing called the Artemis Accords, which include a code of conduct for how they're to behave out in space. And, it boils down to saying we're all going to be very good chaps, a bit like the 79 agreement. And of course, the main motivation for coming up with a code of conduct for themselves is that they want to preempt an international treaty. An international treaty would have aspects to it that would be inconvenient for commercial activity. So if we can make our own rules and govern, apply our own rules and adjudicate whether or not they're broken, that's much more convenient to us, which is in effect what they've done. But I'll just keep repeating. I think that transnational, international agreement, trading on the fact that, at least for a time, most parties to most agreements do tend to observe them, again, if it's in their interests, in order to appear to be, good neighbours on the planet and to, be good citizens of the planet, at least for a time. And that does impose a certain kind of restraint. It's a bit like having speed cameras on the motorway. It does have a little bit of restraining effect, not entirely. But that would be the way to go, rather than relying upon self-government and codes of conduct that the institution has come up with itself.
The front.
Henry Wood, Hatfield College. I just wanted to ask actually what your view on what the ethical basis for mining on the moon is altogether, and specifically I wanted to just come back to your maxim that something that belongs to nobody belongs to everybody, and drawing an analogy with the sea. Whilst the sea is something which is within our environment, and of course going beyond into other planets, do humans even have a justification to be there?
I think ethical considerations arise when there is a potential for harm done to the target of those aspirations. So mining on Earth, for example, if it has deleterious environmental consequences, does raise ethical issues about whether or not one should do it or how one should do it. But on the moon, there are no such considerations. So the ethical questions that arise in connection with mining on the moon that don't relate to the moon or its environment, but applies rather to how you're going to relate to other agencies doing the same thing. What kind of behavior you're going to indulge in with respect to them. That's where the ethical considerations begin to arise. But there's nothing unethical about mining on the moon, providing it is done in ways that respect other people who are trying to do the same thing, and which don't bring back to Earth what could happen, namely conflict, disagreement, even shooting war. So I think that's where the ethical dimension of this lies.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, of course, the moon is of cultural significance across the world. Many religions hold the moon to be a sacred object, and many have voiced concerns that mining on the moon oversteps that boundary. How might you respond to that?
Well, I don't find that very persuasive. I mean, I think from the point of view of people on Earth who regard the moon as sacred, the moon's not going anywhere and it won't look any different. You know, it is a very, very, very big object. So even if there were 1,000 mines on the moon, or 1,000 bases on the moon, or colonies on the moon, then a little bit like the view of Earth from the moon, it's just a big blue thing. You know, you can't see, you know, individual structures on it or entities on it. So from that point of view, there's going to be no change to it in its relation to how it's viewed traditionally on Earth. Maybe people who think, oh God, there are people trampling all over the moon and digging it up and so on, might be distressing for them. But, you know, I think the people doing the trampling and the digging up there are not themselves going to care very much about it. I think that ship has sailed, so you might say. It's a bit too late to worry about that aspect of the moon.
Gentleman there.
Charles Northeastern College. I was wondering if you thought in kind of the distant future, once if these.
I have to slightly lip read in the acoustic of this building, so I need to see your face. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so I was just wondering in the future, if these treaties are kind of successful, or some kind of treaty is successful, and we see international cooperation in space, do you expect that there'll be some kind of back propagation and things will change on Earth? There'll be kind of less nationalism or more cooperation and something?
Well, that's a very interesting thought, that one. One can always hope. You know, if a really, really good set of arrangements were put in place and then people did really start to behave sensibly out there in space, you know, and in the medium to longer term, if there were really well-functioning colonies out there in space that put us to shame back here on Earth, then it might improve our behavior. Who knows? But you know, it's a very attractive thought.
Gentleman over there.
Hugo Peter Bryant, St Mary's College. So I was wondering what you might say to people who tell you these problems will be experienced long after I am dead. Why should I put my time and effort to solve them? What would you say to those people?
I would say that's jolly mean-minded of them, that you know, to just boot our problems down the road for other people to take care of, and then if we rely only on self-interest, then we can consider what future generations would think of us as a lazy, selfish bunch, you know, for not having realized that there was a problem and done something about it sooner. So no, I don't think that kind of consideration washes at all. Interestingly enough, Derek Parfit, in discussing climate change, did raise the point that there is an argument, I don't know whether he himself espoused it, but that people in the future, let us say at the end of the century, once great swathes of the planet have become uninhabitable and unfarmable, and sea levels have risen, and there have been vast problems with vast hordes of migrants escaping, you know, starvation and so forth, and the world is kind of adjusted to that new reality. He said, why should we now, today, second guess what they would value and how they would live their lives and what they would see as a reasonable or decent way of living. Maybe they would come to a whole new accommodation, and in the main it might be as satisfying for them then as life is for us now. If that consideration had weight, then we shouldn't bother about it, because why are we imposing our choices and preferences on what future people would like the world to be? So there is that thought anyway, the typical sort of philosopher's thought. But then what counters it, I think, is that in thinking about what might happen or what the consequences might be, it seems to me that we have a duty to act by our best lights. That we should do what we regard, given how things are with us and how they might be looking forward, we should act in a way that tends towards what we now see as the best outcome. That if we didn't care that a worse outcome, an outcome that we, if we experience it, would regard as worse, actually evolved for future people, then we would be failing in a duty to do that. And this is, by the way, if you're asking yourself the question, why does a professor of philosophy write a book about the moon? That's the reason why. Yeah.
I would just say that I think there's a large lack of that duty in general, and that it's a very important job to try and reinstill that as much as possible philosophically.
Yeah.
Next question.
There was a question. Oh, sorry. There. Yes. Go on.
Fernanda Kemp, St. John's College. With the current possibility of lunar colonization and border framing, immigration challenges could quickly arise. So what would you advise you the possibility of a lunar immigration system, seeing that most of the first colonies could be placed in the US, which also faces its own national and earthly immigration challenges?
I know, well, it makes the hair stand up on the back of one's neck to think that the moon might be, having tremendous arguments over immigrants and trying to raise moon fences and things to stop them from coming in. I should think history will repeat itself as it always does, first as tragedy and then as comedy. And so what the comedy on the moon might be that immigration would be encouraged. In the United States of America, up until the early 1920s, mass immigration was encouraged because of the westward expansion of the US. And you know all about Turner's frontier thesis and so on. So more and more people were needed, and the rapid industrialization of the country was hungry for labor. And so masses of people crossed the Atlantic, and there was the great melting pot ideal, which of course hasn't been realized, but that was the hope anyway. But then when they had enough people, and when some of the social problems that arose from different communities abrading against one another had become apparent, in the early 20s they brought down the gate. And ever since then, of course, there have been questions about immigration. And as the richer northern hemisphere, more advanced economies have become more attractive, but at the same time the poor south, as people call it, become more tense and strife-ridden, pushing people away from behind and pulling them by attraction from the front. So we see major migration efforts being made, both in North America and in Europe. And this causes tensions and difficulties. It's hard to imagine this happening on the moon for a very long time, but it could. So maybe today we should come up with a lunar immigration policy and put it in place, which is humane and just and welcoming, I would think.
Jonas for University College. Over the course of history, technology has been improving, humans have expanded their range, now we're even going to the moon. Do you think there is a limit to this expansion? Do you think there might even be a collapse at some point? You kind of see bacteria, for example, in a petri dish, and given the limited amount of nutrients, they kind of plateau after a while. They don't continue that exponential expansion. Do you think there is a limit to our expansion as humans?
Gosh, it's very hard to say. You know what they say about prophecy, that it's a mug's game, especially if it's about the future. So on the question of whether there are limits to technological development, it's very hard to say. One thing one can contemplate, however, is that technological development can become self-consuming. So, for example, if you think about the very, very short time between the discovery of the structure of the atom and the development of the atom bomb, I mean, it was really less than half a century, you can see how advances in knowledge and applications via technology of that knowledge can really turn around and bite us. So that could happen with any of our technologies. It may very well be happening with AI at the moment. I don't know how many of you are writing your essay now so that you can be here this evening, but you can see how downsides of these things always exist, and some can be very, very serious. So one thing that one can't do is prophesy what might happen and when it might happen, but what one can do is recognize the possibility of something happening and not delaying and putting in place something that would help us to manage it. And that is exactly what I'm arguing about the moon.
No more questions. We'll leave it there. Oh, no more? Oh, sorry, Rick. You want to go?
Yeah, you mentioned the idea of civilizations growing separately on perhaps Mars with their own sort of identity separate from one we have on Earth. I can imagine a similar thing on the moon, perhaps. Do you think we should encourage this earlier, separating lunar civilizations from their roots on Earth earlier, giving them their own identity? Rather than maintaining, for example, the American identity?
Interesting point. So there are two separate things. One is encouraging the establishment of colonies, and the other is encouraging them to become independent and to have their own way of doing things. The second would be difficult to do because the colonies in question would tend to follow the logic of their foundation and their history. So that has been the case throughout history. It might be worthwhile making a deliberate effort to do it differently, that's for sure. And in some cases, of course, that has been the case. I mean, again, the United States of America is an example here, because it had been, an extension of Britain for a couple of centuries by the time of the American War of Independence, and they did they attempted a big reset. Of course, if you dig into the weeds of it a little bit, you see that what they did was to slightly remodel what they were already used to, the tripartite system of government and so on. And that is why the United States today is one of the 50 or so Westminster model countries in the world, despite the variations among them. And therefore, even the effort to reset and to do something new, to start from scratch and to do it by agreement and on principles, even that somehow or other continues, inherits the stain, if you like, of where it comes from.
Alexander Newton from Durham School. You mentioned previously, of course, history repeating itself, and you've mentioned so many examples of similar situations. Why would this be any different? Why could this be any different than the bad examples that you've used previously?
Well, yes, you're right. I mean, I do bang on about the fact that we tend to repeat these cycles, and that would seem, if we were just pessimistic, stroke realistic about it, that the same bad old things would happen out there. But on the other hand, the idea that even if we carried, as it were, the stain from the past into it, that we could try to reset, or that in full consciousness of the fact that we have this negative propensity to repeat our mistakes and to do things the bad old way. But with that tremendous kind of effort to do it differently, it's not impossible that we might be able to make a good enough change. But the argument of my book about the moon is not really for change. It's really for trying to do better something that we've already tried a number of times, which is to have an effective structure, an effective framework for how we relate to one another and behave in space. That's the idea. That's what these big UN treaties were aiming to do. And they don't fail because of any intrinsic deficits of the treaties themselves. They fail because people won't agree to them, because it gets in the way of the usual bad old thing, which is the usual bad old story in human affairs, which is the profit motive.
Well, thank you all. Can you all join me in a round of applause for Professor Grayling?